Welcome to Race as a Corporate Diversity Mandate, addressing race in corporate spaces and the evolution of DEI functions as they respond. I'm very fortunate to have two leaders join me. Sarah Bodie, who is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for EMEA and Asia Pac for Northern Trust and based in the UK. And Danielle Price, Chief Inclusion Officer at Paul Weiss, based in the US. So welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. And Danielle, actually, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us about your journey to your current role?
Sure. Thank you. And it's good to be with everyone today. I'm Danielle Price. I'm the Chief Inclusion Officer, but encompassed in inclusion, of course, is diversity and equity as well. I am a lawyer by training. For those who may not know, Paul Weiss is a global corporate law firm with over $1 billion plus in legal services to our clients around the globe. So starting off as a lawyer by training, I worked for a large law firm in Atlanta, Georgia. I was I was the only person of color, and I was only one of three women in my starting class. And how I came to doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work is that those years practicing were very challenging. I realized quite early on that I was going to have a harder time than some of my classmates in terms of just developing relationships, having access to the best work, the best clients, because I was often mistaken for either the secretarial support or I was mistaken, just not as the lawyer on the team. And so I think really my diversity career, quite frankly, began at that point because I was often pressed into service in terms of recruiting initiatives, just mentoring people who did eventually come behind me. So I say my diversity career really started as a lawyer while I was a lawyer at this firm in Atlanta, Georgia. Fast forward, I officially started my diversity career when I moved to New York to work for Goldman Sachs. And so I feel like I received my law degree from the University of Virginia, but I received my MBA, quite frankly, from Goldman Sachs. Just learning about financial services, service industries in general. And from there, around 2005, 2006, most international law firms began to model a lot of what was happening in professional services in financial services. So at that time, it was very rare to have a lawyer who also had a diverse background. So I've been at Paul Weiss for 15 years now, been through economic downturns, obviously, all kinds of global events. We're obviously currently still navigating the pandemic. And so all of that comes into play in my day job as the chief strategist around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you so much. Wow. A varied career for sure. And Sarah, tell us about your journey.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Really nice to be with you today. I am currently the Chief Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Officer at Northern Trust. Northern Trust, if you don't know, it is a global financial services organisations. We're in over 20 countries around the world, just over 20,000 employees who we call partners. So forgive me occasionally if I might today talk about partners. I mean partners in a very different sense to what Danielle is probably meaning if she uses the same word. I have been working in diversity and inclusion for over 15 years now. I started my career in human resources, initially actually a very short stint in the legal sector, but since then always in financial services organisations, typically large, multinational, often US headquartered financial services companies, doing a variety of human resources roles, particularly in recruitment and graduate recruitment. And then, as I said, about 15 years ago, moved into diversity, as it was called then. It then went through the iteration of diversity and inclusion. Equity, I know, has been added by many companies over the last couple of years, including us here at Northern Trust, but always with that lens into the financial services industry. You will know that it's an industry that has struggled with diversity, equity and inclusion aspects for different organisations, but definitely as an industry as a whole. So it's been really, really challenging. When I moved over to Northern Trust 5 years ago now, what was somewhat unique at the time was that the diversity and inclusion function reported directly to the CEO. So we work in very close partnership with our human resources colleagues, but we do sit separate to them. And that has brought some advantages to it as well. And yeah, 5 years later, still here. My primary responsibility is for the EMEA and APAC regions, so everything outside of North America.
Great, thank you. So great jumping off point. I'll start with you, Sarah. We can say that 2020 presented a lot of opportunity to make significant change, and would love to hear about your, navigating that. What were some of the ambitions as that was developing and happening, and on what you could accomplish, and really, what do you know now that versus what you knew then? So with those ambitions, some lessons learned, a little bit of 2020 hindsight. Sarah.
Yeah, sure. We started the year obviously with the pandemic, and that brought a lot of change and a lot of difference to most diversity and inclusion practices within corporations. The way that we work, the way that we had to change very, very quickly, brought, I think, a lot of opportunities as well as challenges. But I think it also really highlighted very quickly the inequity that sits there within our society, particularly amongst race and ethnicity. Right, we saw very quickly that communities within, for people of colour were affected by COVID to a much greater degree. People of colour were getting sick more often, people of colour were passing away more often, people of colour didn't have the access to healthcare all around the world that white individuals or other groups had. And so even before some of the events around social justice, the murder of George Floyd, and so what came a couple of months after the start of the pandemic, we were already seeing how race and ethnicity, how systemic the issues around race and ethnicity were. As diversity and inclusion practitioners and for people of colour, we knew that they were there. They've been there for centuries, one could argue for millennia even. But it was through the pandemic that I think that opened a lot of individuals' eyes to what was there. Most organisations, I think, had a mandate, a strategy in place around race and ethnicity already. Certainly at Northern Trust we did. It's been high on our agenda for many years. But I think what the pandemic and then later after George Floyd's murder and the murder of so many other people before and after as well, I think it really spread the understanding, awareness, and taken in the right way, the education that people needed around this within the corporate space. I think it was easy to either other it, that this was something that kind of doesn't happen within the corporate sphere, or certainly that doesn't happen in our company. We're somehow immune to that. I think it allowed all companies to really stand back and say, this does happen. Every company is part of society. Racism is sadly part of society. Therefore, it absolutely sits within our four walls, and allowed a more openness to address that at a corporate level. But then I think also for individuals, again, through that awareness, through the education, to really understand the role that they played. That just because you're not a racist yourself doesn't mean you haven't and aren't benefiting from racism. And I think more of that kind of nuanced conversation, looking at racism rather than it being a polar opposite of either I'm racist or I'm not racist, that it's a continuum, and for people to understand where they are on that continuum and then educate to move forward. So lots of opportunities. But I think there was a lot that corporates had to do to act very quickly in this space as well.
Thank you, Danielle. Operating out of the US, I would imagine that the experience was even more intense.
Yes, Paul Weiss is headquartered in New York City. So New York obviously was one of the main epicenters of the pandemic, as we have, three major international airports in the New York tri-state area. And so very quickly, especially with the law firms are, I think, as most people probably know, very traditional still. Definitely can be more conservative in practices. And so we didn't even have an official remote working policy when this pandemic hit. And so, very quickly, literally from a Friday to a Monday, the entire firm shut down in person across North America. And we had to figure it out by Monday. You had to figure out, how are you communicating with your teams? How are you communicating, across departments, across offices, et cetera. So our number one challenge was just, do we know how to do this? Do we know how to operate and still perform at the level of excellence that is expected of us? And the great news is, as with most companies and most organizations in 2020, we had a banner year. It was one of our highest performing years to date. And so, where that presents a challenge currently is, okay, so it was always speculative before as to whether or not, working remotely, not working sort of in the same place. Law is an apprenticeship at its core. And so, are we able to really learn? Are we really able to advance? And most importantly, are we able to service our clients if we're now all living, under our homes, under our separate roofs? And, where we're challenged today is that we now know not only can we do it, we performed exceptionally. And so now where we're challenged is, how do we come out of the pandemic? How do we create a new normal? As we create this new normal, this hybrid is, the word everyone's sort of talking about right now. As we create this hybrid work environment going forward, how then do we, overlay DE and I with this new normal that we all will be experiencing and co-creating. Um, you know, a lot of what Sarah said is so very important in terms of when you look at DE and I in terms of a personal commitment versus DEI at the institutional level, organizational level. And so it's very easy. I shouldn't say easy, but socially minded corporations and organizations absolutely, either made public statements about racism, social justice, contributions to certain organizations that advance social justice. And so at the institutional level, Paul Weiss included, our chairman is quite front and center on race and social justice issues. We always have. Quite frankly, we were formed in that way 70 years ago. So we were quite vocal, about supporting the Legal Defense Fund, and, when Stop Asian Hate was definitely happening, the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, et cetera, et cetera. But it was my job to say, but are we also looking internally? And so it's extremely important that corporations, that, other organizations understand that yes, there is a corporate responsibility, but everyone within that organization has to also feel a personal responsibility. And so at Paul Weiss, we spent a great deal of 2020 just educating, building awareness, having courageous conversations that either we had talked about before in the past, but sort of not on the deep dive level of, what is your personal commitment? What is your personal experience? So 2020 has just been, or 2020 was, the opportunity to rethink, reimagine, and relearn who we are, individually, but also collectively.
And were there things or areas, topics, or activities, conversations that you felt you now had the ability or permission to just go forward with that you didn't before? And also, were there any surprises, areas where you thought, oh, I didn't think it would be that hard to go down this path? Either Sarah or Danielle.
Well, I'll jump in. So three of probably the four most well-known African American lawyers in the country are partners at Paul Weiss. So Jay Johnson, who now is often on many of the Sunday morning talk shows, Jay was the former head of Homeland Security under the Obama administration. Ted Wells, who is one of the premier trial lawyers in the country, and then Loretta Lynch, who is the former Attorney General under the Obama administration. All three are partners at Paul Weiss, and of course, all have achieved tremendous things in their careers. And graciously, they agreed the Monday after the murder of George Floyd. We had a firm-wide town hall moderated by our chairman, who Brad Karp is a white male. But Brad basically invited the entire firm to listen to not only Jay, Loretta, and Ted's perspectives as lawyers. Loretta has been involved in police reform, pretty much her entire career. Jay, being the head of Homeland Security, certainly was speaking to the aspect of, can you use the government, to interrupt protests, et cetera, et cetera. So, they came to the conversation talking from their legal background, their professional background, but they both all three of them graciously talked about what it was like to be a Black professional. And Ted often talks about his life mirrors Brown versus Board of Education. He started school in kindergarten, having been in Washington, D.C., integrating his kindergarten class, and that his entire life, quite frankly, his entire education has been around integrating schools. And so that did, I think, for the entire firm, it personalized. George Floyd obviously was traumatic for everyone, but it personalized that wasn't a one-off situation for most people in the Black community. It just happened to be recorded this time. And so having your colleagues lend their lives, quite frankly, to explaining how racism, how meritocracy isn't always a meritocracy, how those things really play out in the lives of people who are so highly respected, it really helped a lot of people reframe, how does racism really work? What are the consequences? And so that kicked us off, and we've been having those types of courageous conversations pretty much on a monthly basis ever since.
Great. And so, Sarah, I'll actually take this opportunity to talk a separate but related question. So certainly organizations, as you've said, made statements, made commitments, donated, and have launched into, many activities where they're increasing awareness and actually addressing systems and processes. And so there have been mandates to diversify boards for gender in the UK and Europe. And that's, been very front and center. And, there's been a lot of activity around that. So I just wanted to get your perspective on how useful, helpful that is, and if that's really working. Are, women having an equal voice and equal power, or is it more tokenization? And you just have to check the box. So what has your experience been with that and with your firm?
Yeah, so there has definitely been a move over the last few years within some countries within Europe, not all. I definitely wouldn't. This is a true example of where we can't just talk about a continent, because there's huge differences across the continent. But there definitely have been a move to mandate, in many cases, diversity on boards. What I would say is has primarily really only focused on gender. So no country, to my knowledge, within the European context at the moment anyway, has really looked at other forms of diversity on the board. And we know as D&I practitioners that whilst it's not perhaps out there and spoken about, what organisations, regulators, governments, whatever, are usually pushing there for is white women on boards, right? Not a lot of thought is given to the diversity of women on boards. And so I think whilst the move is good, and I think it has certainly brought diversity to places, corporate life, where it was desperately needed. I think sometimes it's been a bit of a blunt instrument, or not as sophisticated as it could be, and pushing companies to really look at why are we even saying we want more women on boards? It's that diversity of thought, it's that diversity of experience that those women bring, but let's make that as diverse as possible. One of the first countries to do this was in Norway. And what they found fairly quickly, only a couple of years after the regulations had been brought in, when they looked beyond just the number of women on boards, but who these women actually were, it was the same names cropping up again and again. So the same women sitting on multiple boards. Fantastic, they're bringing their experience to those boards. But is that really getting to this diversity that was behind that in the first place? If you've just got the same sort of collection of, I don't know how many it was, 30, 40, 50 women sort of working their way around all these boards, in my view, that isn't real, true diversity. So I think it's been a good start. It's forced organisations to think. I have also, though, heard some stories from women, particularly where it was forced and they end up being the only woman on the board, that it has ended up being somewhere where they don't feel they have a voice, somewhere where they're still, ridiculed by the other men on the organisation. That is few and far between, that experience, but it is, it is still out there, and something that you have to think about. But I know a lot of companies have taken it very, very seriously. It's not tokenism. They are really putting a lot of efforts to look at their board diversity and then make sure that is being trailed down through the organisation as well, that they don't just stop at the board because that's where the regulation says you have to focus, that they're really looking at how does that look in the senior management team and below as well. So I do think there is a place for regulation around this, but I would like to see it always done in a more holistic and inclusive way than it is at the moment.
Thank you. And Danielle, same question to you. Obviously, you're a global organization, but I would extend this to race as well, where the let's call it the easy way to do diversity is let's put somebody who looks different or somebody who is different in a role. Maybe it's not a P&L role. Maybe it's not a role that has actual influence. And then once you do it, it's like, okay, I'm done. We've accomplished the goal, and that's not really it. And so would be interested in your perspective in your organization and what you've seen with your clients as well. And also, what is it when we talk about diversity? Are we talking about gender? Are we talking about race, ethnicity? And frankly, the value of having intersectionality, of not just a Black person or just a woman, but a Black woman, for example. So I'll stop talking so you can answer the question.
All fantastic points. Right. I mean, so listen, diversity matters, meaning representation matters. So I think, it's important to make it known and clear and expected that boards should be more diverse. But this is also where we should probably talk a little bit about intent versus impact. And so though the intention is very well received, we want to diversify boards, we want to diversify C-suites, etc. The impact is speculative at this point, because if we are simply, looking at numbers, is a woman on the board, there is a Black person on the board, there is an Asian person on the board, etc. Then sure, there's representation from traditionally underrepresented groups. But there's research, there's a lot of different research, but coming out of the 30% Coalition, they came up with a rule of three, which basically says that in order to have the impact, which is to really have diversity of thought, diversity of lived experiences, as Sarah said, it really takes 3 people minimum, or 30% of an organization, in order to really see the intention lived out, that the intent and the impact, coalesce. Being that when you're an only, you're still marginalized. The research shows that the microaggressions are still there. The sense of having to work harder to get your points across, or to bring a different perspective, without that support, without others in the room who are willing to support that point of view, you're literally then perhaps a token, and that's not, I think, what anyone intends, but that does end up becoming the impact. So I think it's been great that there have been all these mandates. We've certainly spent a lot of time with our clients, advising them on, can they set targets, for how many people they want to see in certain positions by X year. From the lawyer's perspective, we're always making sure that those things are legal, those things are able to be carried out. And most importantly, just from a risk management perspective, we're advising our clients that you need to get on board with this. It's certainly the moral imperative and the right thing to do, but just from the business case, you are not an innovative business if you do not have diverse representation at very senior levels. So I think we still have a ways to go to see, like I said, whether or not these mandates are going to net or cause the impact that I think companies and organizations desire.
And I think that's where we have to challenge again this kind of more binary view around tokenism, and by that I mean at the moment it's either that you're putting a woman or a black person or a person with disabilities or whoever, somebody from the LGBT community on your board to be tokenistic or not. And I truly believe that there's a middle ground there that actually organisations should be looking for. Yes, you're putting them on your board because you want that diversity of thought, that diversity of experience and so forth. And you have a significantly increased chance of bringing that diversity to your board if they are a woman, if they're a woman of colour, if they're somebody from the LGBTQ community. So I find it a bit difficult sometimes when we have to think of these things as being one or the other. I want the fact that a candidate that's come forward for a board position, a senior management position, is a woman, is a person of colour, to be one of the things that we are consciously considering because of the benefits that brings. And some people would label that as tokenism. I would just invite people to kind of look at that in a slightly different way.
Thank you for that thoughtful response. Go ahead, Danielle.
Well, so we didn't sort of address intersectionality yet, but Sarah's just now introduced it. You certainly asked the question. And I think, what makes all of this challenging is rarely do we show up to anything as only a woman, only a Black person, only LGBTQ, only, from the South, only, from wherever. I mean, we are complex individuals, and we bring all of those complexities, to our organizations. And so it does become challenging when you are trying to diversify anything, but categorizing perhaps inaccurately who people are, how they identify, their lived experiences, and especially in the U.S., we have a propensity to only look at visual identities. What stands out, visually, and number one, that's a mistake because I may not identify with how you perceive me. And then also, it's a mistake because, as we know, many of our identities are not visible. They don't sort of readily present themselves. And so, what richness are you missing out on simply because you can't perceive what my points of view will be, what my thought process will be? And even if you can perceive it, you may be inaccurate in determining, what my positions will be, what my thinking will be.
Of course, you can't predict, you don't know. And also, as you said, not all of the parts of me that I bring to the room, to the discussion, to the decision, are visible. And so, that's a whole other layer from an intersectionality standpoint. We bring our whole selves. Sometimes we don't expose our whole selves, but we always bring our whole selves. And so, as we talk about tokenism and checking the box and thinking about, well, are organizations doing these things so that they look good? Are they saying things but then not following up on them? Um, I co-authored a paper called The Equity Imperative, What Organizations Can Do, Why Organizations Need to Be Bold Now. And in one part of it, we talk about orthodoxies. So unquestioned assumptions and, things that we don't talk about. And so would like to, ask you, the type of unquestioned assumptions that we're talking about are, as you said, we are a meritocracy. We are an unbiased meritocracy, or we don't have a racism problem here. If we give this role to a woman or a Black person or an Asian person or an LGBTQ person, that means fewer opportunities for all the rest of us, and so forth. Those sorts of underlying assumptions that we don't even always recognize, that are, the basis for our decisions. So if you could pick one orthodoxy, one of the ones I mentioned or any of the other ones that you would want to just completely address and dismantle, which one would you choose, and how and why? I'm going to say Sarah goes first.
Who goes first?
Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a tough one. There were a lot in there, all of them which resonated with heart and head immediately. Having done this work for as long as I have, I think, to me, the meritocracy one is the one that I've certainly heard the longest. Having worked in big US headquartered investment banks back in the good old days, that was said all the time. Like we just we hire on merit, we promote on merit, we don't care about anything else. And that is essentially saying that you therefore don't think that anything else exists in terms of bias, in terms of isms, in terms of, and for as long as you push that out and by that statement subtly say that those things don't exist, you can't begin to address them. And it's just such a fallacy, right? I mean, no human being in history has ever made all their decisions based purely on meritocracy. It's just not how our brains are wired. It's not how our chemistry works. Research scientists have shown that for a long time. And we need to bring that out within corporate organizations to say that's where we'd like to be. It reminds me of Dolly Chugg's book, The Person You Mean to Be. We mean to make fully meritocratic decisions. We want to think that we make fully meritocratic decisions, but we don't. And we really have to bring that out in the open and kind of address that. And to me, particularly in hiring, where I see that, it ties in actually to one of the other orthodoxies, which is this, well, we just want to hire the best. I remember working for shall remain nameless, big US investment bank, a long time ago now, in graduate recruitment. And we were just starting to look at the diversity of the graduates and MBAs and so forth that we were hiring. And I remember speaking to a hiring manager, talking about the diversity of his team, and he was just like, yeah, Sarah, show me the best resumes first, and then I'll have a look at the diverse ones after that. As if in the Venn diagram of best and diversity, there was no meeting middle point at all, that these were diametrically opposite, opposed groups, that you had the best people here and that you had the diverse people over here. And it was a long time ago, but I think there is a lot of that thinking still out there, and we have to really challenge that.
Absolutely. And we do have I do want to hear your answer, Danielle, and we have a question in the chat from I'm sorry, Nadine Drummond, on what that means for changing culture. And so as long as you have that sort of thinking as the underlying assumption, like, I'll look at the diverse candidates after I look at the good candidates. Okay, now we know that that's something. What does that mean for the culture of the organization? How does the organization need to change? And we talk about this in the Equity Imperative. Culture is beliefs, values, and behaviors. And those behaviors are based on those values, and those values are based on beliefs. So what do we need to change about the culture in order to get away from those assumptions?
Well, so it's a fantastic question, and that is the heart of DE&I work, because you really are trying to challenge the norm to say, is that the norm for everyone? And I think we all know, rarely is that the case. It's the dominant group that tends to set culture, because traditionally they've been the majority. And so how they operate, and I definitely don't want to get into a us versus them kind of conversation, but culture is created normally by the dominant group. And so there has to be a lot of time, a lot of energy spent educating and building awareness. And that is quite frankly what the pandemic did. It was a reckoning. It was, starkly clear to most, I would say, that the inequities are real. This is not the imagination of Black and brown people across the globe. This is not, you know, whining, this is not, well, if you had just behaved properly, this wouldn't have happened to you. I think, people had to sort of face the reality that we don't live in an equitable society yet. And so the more that there is drill and practice, for lack of a better word, around how do you interrupt those biases? How do you interrupt that thinking to incorporate all of the voices that were not perhaps in the beginning of an organization included, that became part of the culture. And so that's what's been fascinating, and really helpful within our organization. Again, I mentioned the courageous conversations. I mean, the humility of a lot of our partners to simply say, I didn't know that. Wow, I'm listening. And you're right. I'm not worried about getting on the subway as they hear from their Asian colleagues that, people are being pushed in front of subways simply because they're Asian. Um, and so, it's taken the humility of all of us to say, just because I have not personally experienced something, it doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean that it's not valid. And so the more that we can, have space for those conversations, B, the vulnerability for those who perhaps didn't feel like they could even bring that aspect of their lived experience to the workplace, making sure that those people feel comfortable sharing. Not, I want to be cautious here, not putting them in the position of teaching, not putting them in the position of educating those who don't know, but being willing when comfortable to accentuate or amplify a professional who may be bringing these ideas to bear, within your organization. It's important. We have to. The workplace was supposed to be where we all just come. Meritocracy, by the way, is my favorite orthodoxy that just has to be destroyed. Its cousin is, are you the right fit? When we talk about recruiting, the more that we challenge just those simple presumed, it is what it is moments, the more that I think people will come to the table saying, I'm not sure I understand this fully, but I'm willing to learn more. And so, it's last thing I'll say about this, the challenge too is timing and managing expectations. It is really difficult to change behavior in a transactional way. That is sometimes the expectation, though. If I do one, then two, then three, then I'll have four. It's also not linear. And so that's part of this as well. Just because we've had four courageous conversations, this quarter, we're not done. There's much more work to do. That's just the beginning. So I'll stop there because that was a lot. But I just think the more that we challenge what is an inclusive culture and ask different people to answer that question, the closer we'll get to really having inclusive environments where we all bring our best selves to work.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, as you said, it takes time and it's not transactional. I'm sorry, Sarah, do you want to pipe
No,
in?
I was just going to say, I so agree. I still see too many people, leaders particularly, consciously or unconsciously, I'm not quite sure, looking for the silver bullet. They want that one thing that they or the organization can do to kind of fix this, because there is a genuine held view in their heart and their head that there is an inequity there, that this isn't right, that if they've got over those hurdles and are able to see that, they just want to fix it. And that's largely what we pay our leaders to do, right? Is to fix our clients' problems, to meet their challenges where they are. But with something like this, it's not fixable in one action, in a series of conversations, as Danielle said. There's so much learning and unlearning that needs to happen before you can even begin to start to get to many of the solutions. And it's highly individualized. Again, as D&I practitioners, we know the work in meeting people where they are, not where you want them to be. That's very, very challenging. But the onus there is also on the individual to do that education, to understand, okay, where am I actually at the moment? Not where do I want to be, where do I mean to be, but where am I really, and what are those gaps that I need to fill?
Perfect, thank you. And so Rosalind Kenya has a comment that relates to my next question. When we talk about representation, what do we mean? Do we mean in society? Do we mean our clients and customers, or consumers? And what I'll add to that is, we don't want tokenism, but we want the representation. And so it's not transactional, but there has to be accountability, right? And so if all we do is say, we need X number of these people by Y date, otherwise you don't get your bonus, that works one way. If we say, let's educate ourselves so that we can all be better people, that works a different way. What is your perspective on what the right approach is to accountability, and what representation really is and means, and where it's meaningful?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that one. So I think the representation argument is a good one. As you said, is it just about the numbers? And what do those numbers mean? And those numbers mean different things to different people, right? And what's behind that? As I said before, it's not just about that tokenism. It's about what do those diverse individuals bring to a team, an organization, a project, whatever it may be. I think accountability often rushes towards the numbers, often rushes towards that, okay, let's count people. As Danielle pointed out earlier, that brings all sorts of problems in terms of, what are you counting? How are you counting? How are people identifying? Organizations have gender goals in place to get to X percentage, usually female, by, a certain date. Where does that leave our non-binary colleagues in that, male-female split? People of colour representation, where does that, leave people who have multiple different identities? We talked about intersectionality. There's these boxes that we're trying to kind of force people into, and often ask them to choose between as well, which really just don't work for a lot of individuals. That said, I do think goals, targets do have their place, as long as the meaning behind them, again, as Danielle said, the intent behind why have you got those in place is there, for the right reasons. Because yes, you don't want to be hired or promoted, just because you're a woman, or you're a woman of color, or you're a gay woman, or whatever. But you also don't want to not be hired or not be promoted because you tick one or more of those boxes. And the data shows at the moment, to a greater or lesser extent, that does have a big reason in why women and women of colour are not getting those positions. So I think it's that balance between those things, that balance between accountability of not just the pure quantitative hard numbers, but all of the qualitative inclusion, awareness, education that goes around that as well. And because it's more difficult to put measures against that, some organisations shy away from that and just overly focus on the numbers.
Danielle, how have you approached accountability?
Well, I think it's a both and proposition. So, at the institutional level, any organization should always be looking at systemic issues within their systems. So, making sure that, recruiting, all of the talent management cycle, is equitable, that bias is not sort of embedded in those systems. That's what you can do at the organizational level. But there also has to be accountability at the individual level. And so one of the things that we've implemented, if our culture values diversity, equity, and inclusion, are we measuring on that? Is that a competency that can be scored or measured in terms of your performance? And if not, why not? And so that's a question we asked ourselves a number of years ago, which is, we keep saying that this matters to us. We keep saying that we were a organization founded on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So is that part of our performance review process? And what we, surprisingly realized is no. And there are, competencies, there are behaviors that we can institute at levels of seniority. We obviously want inclusive leaders, but middle managers, or in the case of law firms, it's our mid-level associates who have just as much influence on the development of our young junior associates, as even more so in some cases than the partner. And so we're spending all this time, educating our leadership on how to create an inclusive culture, but have we really looked at, our senior associates, our mid-level associates? Do they understand that this is a culture imperative? And if we understand that, then why aren't we measuring on that? And so we, put into the performance process, do you demonstrate, equitable management of a case team? Do you, encourage development of younger people? There are a variety of things, but, making sure that if this is something we value, then it should be measured in the same way as we're, measuring their development in terms of their legal skills. And so that's one concrete example of something that we did recently. The other thing that's happening is, especially in professional services organizations, our clients are demanding diverse teams on their matters. And so forget if you think this is the right thing to do, forget if you even sort of know how to think, in an inclusive way. You better learn, because our clients are saying, wait a minute, why am I not seeing senior women on this team? Wait a minute, why are there very few people of color? Or if there are people of color, why are they only in the junior ranks? Why aren't they, in leadership roles within this matter? And so the more our clients partner with us, and quite frankly, that's been a great deal of my work over the last year, is really partnering with our clients to say, what would you like to see? Can you help us develop that talent? And the partners, who are also diverse, 30% of our women partners are women of color. 35% of our women associates are women of color. And so you can no longer say, well, I'm only going to develop the person, if you're a straight white male, you can't say, I'm only going to develop the person that looks like me, that went to the school that I went to, whatever. You have to know how to develop this talent, because the client is holding the organization, the law firm in this case, accountable for whether or not, there are diverse people working on their matters. And so that sort of internal look, as well as the external accountability from our clients, is what tends to move the needle most for us. So it's again, managing expectations. This all takes time. That being said, start with representation. If you don't even have the people within your organization, certainly you've already ruined your advantage with any particular client. So
Thank you. Thank you. So I do want to make sure that the audience knows that we are getting some questions in. So if you have any other questions, now's the time. But my final question is around equity. And so we're no longer D&I officers, we are DEI officers, or DE&I officers. And so in the equity imperative, we make a case for why equity is where we need to focus. Equity is the outcome, right? And in order to get to that outcome, there are things we need diversity, we need inclusion. We also need anti-oppression, or directly addressing the systems and the processes that actually create the environment or the culture or the decision making that gets to inequitable outcomes. So I'd love to hear your perspective on what equity means, what that outcome means beyond diversity and inclusion, or how diversity and inclusion drives towards equity, and what would be required to get there. I'll go back to you, Danielle.
So, first of all, I want to put a plug in for the equity imperative. It is so well thought out. It is, I think it captures, quite frankly, where we are in this moment better than some of the other things that I've seen and read in recent history. And so, congratulations on that, because I do think you're highlighting the right issue, which is equity. Equity is the outcome. And I think the main word that I keep saying within my organization over and over again is intentionality. We have to be intentional in our solutions. And by the way, that means it's not one size fits all. That is where the equity begins. If we're seeing that certain groups are experiencing the work environment differently than others, if we know that certain groups, before they even start their workday, have experienced life differently than others, why wouldn't we put that into the equation in terms of how to develop and advance talent? And so, one of the, again, just a concrete example, as we look at our mentorship programs, it shouldn't be a one size fits all. Different things are required for different people. And I won't even say groups at this point, because that's where the intentionality comes in. How are you doing? Where do you feel like you need more support? Where do you feel like you need advocacy? And how can we match that up? Now, that's difficult, and it's, hard to scale, but that's what it takes. That is what is important, because especially Gen Z, they want to work in organizations that see them for the individuals that they are, with the issues that they care about, being front and center in their workplace. And so it's imperative that all of us really figure out how to create these equitable opportunities, across our organizations. And it requires a lot of work and a lot of intention, and perhaps a rethinking about, how are we training and developing, in this case, our young people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree. I think it's so important for organisations to move on from equality to truly looking at equity. Whenever I think about equity, the Einstein quote about insanity sort of springs to mind, of just doing the same thing again and again and expecting the same outcome. To me, kind of that's almost what sits at the heart of equity, right? We go out, we offer the same to everybody, we treat everybody the same, everything's equal, things will just somehow get better. It's just not addressing that root cause, right? That equality works if you're both starting at the same starting point, and we just know that doesn't happen. And I know there was a question earlier about kind of willful blindness, and I see a lot of that when we're talking about kind of equality versus equity, and the unwillingness, I think, of people to see that, certain individuals, groups, but as Danielle said, really at an individual level, are never going to be able to progress in an organization, a society, wherever it may be, if we don't address those inequities and bring them out in the open, and look for ways collectively to solve them together.
Thank you. And so in our last 2 minutes, we do have one more question in the chat. And Danielle, you alluded to this. If clients are asking for more diverse teams, have we actually lost clients because we haven't had enough diverse teams? I mean, I know with my clients, and in some experiences, until we show up in a certain way, we're not considered. And so we'd love to hear your experience or feedback on that.
So I think that's the next frontier. Especially for legal services, if you are coming to Paul Weiss, you probably have a bet the company situation going on. And so the intersection of, we want a diverse team, but we don't want to lose these $10 billion that are at stake. Often, for example, that's where the challenge lies. Because I will say, from Paul Weiss's perspective, first of all, we're able to supply those diverse teams, so that helps. I've been in meetings where clients have said, the demographics of the team servicing me doesn't match the firm demographics. Why is that? Can we bring more women onto the team? Can we bring more people of color, LGBTQ, onto the team? We're having those conversations. But I don't personally know of other firms where work was literally taken from that firm because they did not present a diverse team. There's been conversation, well, wait a minute, this matters to us. Why did you show up with this non-diverse team at the pitch or, at the trial or whatever the case may be? I don't know yet that we have that like leading example of work was taken from organization 1, non-diverse, and given to organization 2, diverse. But it's coming. It's just a matter of time. So I think that's where clients have the muscle and the power to really move the needle on this, and we'll see.
And I think
Yeah,
that's
unless
where we
the
can
clients
remember that. Sorry, I think that's where we can remember that we are clients as well, right? Every organization is a client of somebody, depending on what you're buying, and you have the ability there to influence, even if you start small and then grow big. Talk about what's important to you. I think in the modern age, it's very easy to know what's important to a client or a prospect anyway, right? It doesn't take a lot of research effort to find out what's important to them. But actually, even if you can't find anything out there that says this client really values diversity, talk about it as a core value for your organization as well. Start the conversation. We're finding clients are talking to us a lot more now when it comes to RFPs and that sort of thing, not just about what can we bring them in the traditional financial services sense, but what are we doing around diversity and inclusion? They're at the beginning of their journey. They can see that we're more advanced. What can we do to partner with them and help them? So think of it as a two-way street.
Absolutely. Well, this hour has flown by. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, Danielle and Sarah. So appreciate it. And thank you, India, for giving us the platform.